They thought I was just a consultant. They could break, but they had no idea they were about to hand the keys to their entire empire to the wrong person. One wrong arrest didn't just end my night, it triggered a sequence that would tear their hidden world apart. I stood on the corner of 5th and Main, the humid city air clinging to my skin like a damp shroud. I was just minding my own business, waiting for my ride, when a patrol cruiser screeched to a halt, the tires biting into the asphalt with a sound that made my teeth ache. Before I could even process what was happening, 2 officers were out of the car, hands resting heavily on their holsters, eyes locked onto me with a predatory intensity that felt entirely unearned. I hadn't looked at them, I hadn't spoken to them, yet here they were, closing the distance as if I were a hardened fugitive, cornered in a dark alley. "You!" the taller one barked, his face a roadmap of suppressed rage. "Hands behind your head. Now." I blinked, confused. "Excuse me? Is there a problem, officer?" "The problem is your attitude," he spat, stepping into my personal space, his badge glinting under the harsh streetlights. "I saw you looking at this car. You think you can stare down law enforcement? You think you're above the rules because you're standing in a nice suit?" I looked down at my attire. It was a standard business suit, professional and understated. I was a consultant for a firm that dealt with high-level logistics and private security, but to these guys, I was clearly just an irritant they wanted to crush. I kept my voice level, though my heart began a frantic drum solo against my ribs. "I'm just waiting for my ride, officer. I haven't done anything to warrant this." Resisting? Disrespecting a peace officer? "That's an obstruction charge, right there," he growled, grabbing my arm and twisting it behind my back with a sickening crunch of my shoulder blade. "Maybe a night in the holding cell will teach you how to show some proper deference to the badge." The handcuffs bit into my wrists, cold and unforgiving. Passers-by slowed down, pulling out their phones, their faces a mix of morbid curiosity and fear. The officer shoved me toward the cruiser, his partner looming behind him, checking the area as if they were expecting me to pull some illegal weapon out of thin air. They treated me like I was a kingpin of an organized scheme, someone who ran a citywide operation, when in reality, I was just a woman who had the audacity to exist in their line of sight without bowing. "You're making a mistake," I said, my voice tight. "I have rights. You can't just drag me in for nothing." "Oh, we can drag you in for plenty," the officer sneered. "We've got all night, and when we get you in that room, we're going to dig. We'll find whatever you're hiding. Maybe it's a bag of prohibited substances. Maybe it's connections to some local radicals. We'll pin whatever we have to on you just to make sure you never look at us that way again. A nice, long, tens of years sentence will keep you quiet for a good long time." He shoved my head down to clear the doorframe, shoving me into the back seat of the cruiser. The smell of old coffee and stale tobacco filled my senses. They weren't just arresting me for disrespect, they were setting me up. I could see it in the way they whispered to each other, the way they clicked their cameras off. They were going to ensure this ended with a permanent mark on my record, or worse, a false accusation of an attempt to break my life with a heavy legal charge. As the door slammed shut, cutting me off from the rest of the world, I realized this wasn't just a power trip. They were looking for a victim, someone they could ruin to make their quotas look better, someone who couldn't fight back. I sat there in the dark, watching the red and blue lights dance on the pavement. I felt a surge of cold fury. I had worked too hard, climbed too far, to be taken down by 2 thugs in uniform who were bored on a Tuesday night. I reached into the hidden lining of my jacket, feeling the sleek, rectangular shape of my secure phone. It wasn't a civilian device. It was tied to a network that didn't appear on any public grid. I tapped the single, glowing icon on the screen, a silent SOS beacon that would alert the only person in the city who could actually stop these men. The officers climbed into the front seat, laughing about their dinner plans as if they hadn't just destroyed a person's dignity. "Where are we taking her, Jim?" the partner asked, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "Maybe the holding center? Or maybe we just take a detour and see what we can shake out of her." "Let's take the long way," Jim replied with a sickening grin. "I want to see her sweat." The car lurched into motion, pulling away from the curb. My phone buzzed in my hand. A single vibration. Confirmed. Arrival in 60 seconds. We hadn't gone 3 blocks when a heavy, matte black armored vehicle swerved violently into our path, forcing the cruiser to slam on its brakes. The impact sent me flying into the partition. Before the officers could even process the roadblock, the doors of the black vehicle swung open. It wasn't the police, it wasn't the internal safety check. It was a group of men in suits sharper than mine, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the area with the precision of a military unit. Then the passenger door of the lead vehicle opened and a man stepped out. He was older, his hair silver, his suit tailored to perfection. The 2 officers, still laughing seconds ago, suddenly went pale. They recognized him. Everyone in the city's upper echelon recognized him. He walked toward the cruiser, his gaze landing squarely on me through the glass, then shifting to the officers. His hand hovered near his jacket, and the lead officer, Jim, visibly trembled. I knew what was coming next, and for the first time since they grabbed me, I smiled. The officer stepped out of the car, his voice shaking. "Sir, we didn't know." "You didn't know?" The man interrupted, his voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. He leaned into the officer's space, his expression unreadable. "You really should have asked who you were pulling over before you decided to try and break a life that isn't yours to touch." The silence that followed his words was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the cruiser's cooling engine. The officer named Jim, usually so full of bravado and petty cruelty, looked as though he'd been struck by a physical blow. He fumbled, his hand darting toward his duty belt before he remembered, in a sudden flash of terror, that reaching for anything in front of this man was a fatal mistake. His partner stayed rooted in the passenger seat, his eyes wide, fixed on the matte black vehicle that looked like a monolith of impending judgment in the middle of the street. The man standing outside the cruiser, Mr. Sterling, the head of the firm I worked for, and a man whose influence spanned far beyond the city limits, didn't blink. He reached out and tapped his ring against the window, right next to my face. "Open it," he commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth. Jim's hands shook so violently the keys rattled against the metal of the doorframe. He managed to unlock it, his face drained of all color, the arrogance replaced by a frantic, animalistic fear. As the door swung open, I didn't wait for them to remove the cuffs. I stood up, the metal biting into my wrists, and stepped out into the humid night. I walked until I stood directly beside Sterling. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes locked on the officers, who were now essentially trapped in the beam of his headlights. "Do you have any idea," Sterling began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "who you just detained? You didn't just stop a civilian. You interrupted a high-level briefing involving the security of this entire sector. You have essentially committed an act of gross interference with a protected operative." "Sir," Jim stammered, his voice cracking. We were just patrolling. We thought there was a report of suspicious behavior. We didn't know she was affiliated with your, organization." "Suspicious behavior?" Sterling let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You pulled her over because your egos were bruised, and in doing so you crossed a line that I suggest you pray doesn't get erased permanently." He turned slightly to one of his men, who had remained silent in the background. "Run a full scan on their cruiser. Everything. The dash cam, the internal logs, the private communications. I want to know exactly what they were planning to do with her once they got her away from the public eye. And call the internal safety check department. We're going to need a full audit of every action these 2 have taken in the last 6 months." The 2 officers looked at each other, their faces now a mask of pure despair. They knew exactly what that meant. A full audit didn't just mean a slap on the wrist, it meant that every dark corner they had hidden in, every falsified report they had filed, and every illegal favor they had traded would be laid bare for a review board that had zero tolerance for corruption. They were looking at the end of their careers, and likely a very long stay in a facility where the inmates were the ones they had spent years putting away. "You can't do this," the second officer finally spoke up, though his voice was barely a whisper. "We're police. We have immunity." Sterling tilted his head, a faint, cold smile playing on his lips. "Immunity is a concept for those who follow the law, officer. When you step outside of it, when you decide that you are the law, you forfeit those protections. You aren't officers anymore. You're just two men who made a catastrophic error in judgment." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that was still audible to all of us. "Did you really think you could play God? Did you really think that nobody was watching? You spent your shifts looking for suspicious activity in others, never realizing that your own organized scheme was the most visible thing in the city." I felt the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a deep, weary ache in my shoulders. Sterling reached out, pulled a small, specialized key from his pocket, and clicked it into my handcuffs. The metal fell away, leaving red, raw welts on my skin. He looked at my wrists, and his expression softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine anger on my behalf. "Get in the car," he said to me, his tone shifting from cold command to something more protective. "We have a lot to discuss, and it doesn't involve these two failures." As I stepped toward the armored SUV, Jim made a desperate, final move. He reached into his jacket, a foolish, reflexive gesture of someone who had lost everything and didn't care who he took down with him. But before his hand could even fully emerge, Sterling's men were on him. There was no struggle, just a sudden, efficient blur of motion. One of the security agents slammed Jim against the hood of the cruiser, his arm twisted behind his back with such force it sounded like wood snapping. "Don't," Sterling warned, not even turning around. "If you reach for anything, an illegal weapon, a phone, anything, this goes from a career-ending situation to a life-ending one. You don't want to see what happens when we stop being polite." The air around us seemed to vibrate with tension. The patrol car's lights continued to pulse, casting chaotic shadows across the street. Suddenly, a siren wailed in the distance. Not the cruiser's siren, but something sharper, more urgent. We all turned to look down the street. 3 more black SUVs were tearing down the road, their sirens blaring, heading directly toward us at a breakneck speed. Sterling's face hardened. He pulled his own radio from his jacket and barked a single word. "Exfiltrate." "Sir," one of his men said, pointing toward the approaching vehicles. "That's not our team. That's a response unit, and they aren't marked for the city police." My heart stopped. These weren't regular officers, and they weren't Sterling's people. As the lead vehicle skidded to a stop, surrounding us in a semicircle of blinding spotlights, the doors flew open. A woman in a tactical suit stepped out, her hand resting on her sidearm, her eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a hunter. She looked at the terrified, restrained officers, then at Sterling, and finally at me. She didn't look like she was here to help. She looked like she was here to finish whatever the patrol officers had failed to do. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice amplified and cold, "you're in the middle of a restricted investigation. We're taking everyone into custody, including the consultant." Sterling stepped in front of me, his posture rigid. "You have no jurisdiction here." "Jurisdiction is a matter of perspective," she replied. And as she stepped into the light, I saw the insignia on her vest. It wasn't just law enforcement. It was an agency I had only heard about in rumors, a department that handled the cases that were too dangerous even for the internal safety check. The situation had just shifted from a local power trip to something exponentially more dangerous. We weren't just being arrested, we were being hunted. And as the woman raised her hand, signaling her team to advance, I realized that the real nightmare hadn't even begun. The street suddenly felt like a pressure cooker with the lid screwed down tight. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and the impending sense of dread that usually precedes a collapse. The tactical team moved with a clinical, terrifying synchronicity, fanning out in a wide arc that cut off any possibility of a quick retreat. They weren't just here to arrest us, they were here to sanitize the scene. "Sterling," I whispered, keeping my eyes locked on the woman who led the unit. "Who are they? This isn't the city. This isn't even the state." Sterling didn't turn his head, but I saw his jaw tighten, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "They're a contingency, Elena. A department that exists to silence the things that the public isn't meant to see. If they get their hands on you, there is no paperwork, no trial, no accidental release. There is only a void." The woman, whose name tag simply read Agent Vane, stepped closer, her boots crunching on the broken glass from the earlier scuffle. She ignored the two trembling patrol officers entirely, their presence beneath her notice now that she had identified a much larger target. She looked at Sterling with a mixture of professional detachment and genuine malice. "We have reports of a significant breach of protocol regarding your firm, Mr. Sterling," Vane said, her voice monotone. "It involves sensitive, prohibited files and a suspected link to a sprawling organized scheme that this city has been trying to bury for years. You've exceeded your mandate, and as for the consultant, she is a material witness to a state-level concern." "You're overstepping," Sterling countered, his voice remarkably steady despite the dozen rifles now aimed in our general direction. "I have clearance that goes 3 tiers above your current unit. If you proceed, you are violating a direct directive from the Oversight Committee." Vane chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "The committee is currently undergoing a reorganization. You're acting on orders from people who no longer hold the keys, Sterling. You've been out of the loop for exactly 60 minutes, and in that time, your status has shifted from an asset to a liability." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The reorganization she mentioned, that wasn't just corporate speak. It meant a coup. Whoever was running this new, shadowy agenda was clearing house, and we were at the very top of their list. I realized then why those 2 pathetic patrol officers had felt so confident in bullying me earlier. They were just the first ripples in a much larger storm. They were the ones assigned to keep me busy until the real cleaners arrived. "Step away from her," Vane commanded, gesturing toward me with a slight flick of her chin. "Unless you want to add interference with a federal operation to the list of charges that are going to guarantee you a massive, decades-long sentence in a windowless cell." Sterling looked at me, and for a fleeting second his mask slipped. I saw the calculation behind his eyes, the realization that we were outnumbered, outgunned, and officially declared enemies of the state. He wasn't looking for a way to win. He was looking for a way to buy me time. "Elena," he said, his voice dropping low, intended only for me. "Do you remember the emergency bypass we discussed last week? The one in the sewer conduits beneath the grid?" I nodded slowly, my heart thumping in my throat. "Yes, but it's keyed to your biometrics, not mine." "Not anymore," he muttered, reaching into his inner pocket and pulling out a small metallic coin that looked like a piece of high-tech circuitry. He pressed it into my palm, his grip lingering for a second. "When I move, you run. Don't look back. Don't stop for anyone. And for the love of everything, don't use your phone. It's tracked now." "What about you?" I asked, a sudden sharp fear piercing through the adrenaline. "I'm the distraction," he said simply. Before I could protest, Sterling spun around, his hand moving with a speed that defied his age. He didn't pull a weapon. He pulled a flashbang device from his tactical belt and slammed it against the asphalt. The world turned into a blinding, white-hot explosion of light and sound. The high-pitched ringing in my ears was deafening, and the smell of sulfur filled my lungs. I didn't think. I just moved. I dove toward the dark alleyway between 2 brick buildings, my boots scrambling for purchase on the wet pavement. Behind me, I heard the roar of voices, the chaotic shouting of agents blinded by the blast, and the distinct rhythmic crack of suppressed fire. I hit the alleyway, my breath coming in jagged, painful gasps. I sprinted toward the manhole cover Sterling had pointed out earlier. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the coin, but as I jammed it into the small circular indentation on the rim, a soft electronic chime echoed in the darkness. The heavy iron cover slid aside with a low, mechanical hiss. I leaped into the darkness, landing hard on a metal catwalk deep below the city streets. I scrambled to pull the cover back into place, sealing myself away from the carnage above. The muffles of shouting and gunfire were distant now, reduced to rhythmic thuds against the earth. I sat there in the pitch black, my chest heaving, the metallic coin clutched in my hand. I was safe, for now. But as I caught my breath, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the sound of the agents above searching for me. It was a soft, steady, mechanical clicking coming from the shadows of the tunnel ahead of me. It sounded like an automated security system resetting itself. Then a voice, hollow, synthesized, and chillingly familiar, echoed through the tunnel, bouncing off the damp walls. Consultant identified. Biometric access verified. Initiating termination sequence as per the new mandate. The lights in the tunnel flickered on, revealing not a way out, but a row of automated sentries, their red targeting lasers locking onto my chest with terrifying precision. Sterling had saved me from the police, only to lead me straight into the maw of an automated trap that had been waiting for the exact moment I crossed the threshold. The red dots danced across my torso like fireflies from hell. I didn't dare move, my breath hitching in a throat that felt like it had been scraped with sandpaper. The sentries were mounted on the ceiling, sleek, obsidian-colored units that looked more like predatory insects than security hardware. Their gimbals rotated with a sickeningly smooth, high-speed whine that made my skin crawl. "System error," I whispered to the empty air, my voice cracking. "I am Consultant Eleanor Vance. Identification code, Delta 9 Alpha. Override command, Sterling 7 Prime." The clicking paused. For a heartbeat, the silence was so absolute, I could hear the rhythmic dripping of sewage somewhere in the dark. Then, the lights shifted from a menacing crimson to a pale, clinical yellow. The red dots on my chest vanished. "Identity verified," the synthetic voice droned, lacking any inflection. "However, your credentials have been flagged as compromised. Access to central node denied. Please remain stationary for custodial pickup." Custodial pickup? I hissed to myself. They weren't letting me go. They were going to trap me in this concrete tomb until Vane or her goons finished their sweep upstairs and came down to finish the job. I looked at the metallic coin in my hand. It was vibrating slightly, the internal circuitry humming with a faint blue pulse. Sterling hadn't just given me an access key. He had given me a lifeline that was rapidly running out of power. If I stayed here, I was a sitting duck. If I moved, the sentries, or whatever other automated nightmares were lurking in the deep grid, would turn me into a statistic. I didn't have much time. I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of heavy boots hitting the manhole cover above. They were descending. Vane wasn't wasting a second. I scanned the tunnel. There was a maintenance ladder to my left, bolted into the wet, slime-covered brick. It led upward, not toward the street, but toward the auxiliary ventilation shafts that connected to the city's older, forgotten subway tunnels. If I could get to the subway line, I might be able to lose them in the labyrinth of tunnels that hadn't been mapped since the late 90s. I lunged for the ladder, my boots slipping on the slick metal rungs. Below me, the sentries suddenly flared back to life, their gimbals locking onto my movement. "Warning. Unauthorized egress," the voice echoed, vibrating through the metal structure. Firing sequence engaged. A surge of energy tore through the air, hitting the wall inches from my hand. The impact showered me in jagged bits of concrete and sparks. I climbed faster, my muscles screaming in protest, ignoring the heat of the near misses. I was a target in a shooting gallery, and the shooter never missed. I reached the top of the shaft and shoved against the metal grate that separated me from the ventilation ducts. It was locked, heavy, and rusted shut. I could hear Vane's team below, their voices bouncing off the tunnel walls, cold and efficient. "She's in the ventilation riser," a voice called out, muffled but clear. "Flush her out with gas." Gas! My heart hammered against my ribs. I wouldn't just be arrested. I'd be incapacitated, dragged out, and likely liquidated before I even woke up. I looked at the coin in my palm, then at the lock on the grate. There was a tiny port on the side of the mechanism, the same size as the coin. I didn't have a choice. I jammed the coin into the port and twisted. There was a screech of metal, a sound like a dying animal, and the grate swung open just as a thick white mist began to pour up from the tunnel floor below. I pulled myself into the duct, the cramped, dusty space smelling of ancient grease and stagnant air. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, my heart rhythmically thumping against the floor of the shaft. I crawled until the tunnel behind me went silent, save for the muffled, angry shouting of the agents below. But as I turned a sharp corner in the duct, I froze. The shaft didn't lead to the subways. It led to a dead end, a massive, reinforced glass observation window looking out into a room I recognized instantly. It was the interior of Sterling's private facility, but it wasn't the office I knew. It was a containment chamber. Inside the room, rows of monitors displayed real-time footage of the city's streets. Standing in the center of the room was a man I'd never seen before, a figure in a sharp gray uniform, his back to the glass. He was typing on a holographic keyboard, manipulating data streams that looked like classified logs from the department that had just tried to kill me. Suddenly he stopped typing. He didn't turn around, but he raised a finger, and a voice spoke through the room's intercom, chillingly crisp and focused. "I know you're in the vent, Elena, and I know you have the override coin." I flattened myself against the wall of the duct, my breath caught in my throat. He knew my name. He knew exactly what I was carrying. "You think you're running from the cleaners," the man continued, his voice echoing in the vent like he was sitting right beside me. "But you're not. You're running exactly where I needed you to go. We've been waiting for you to trigger that coin. It's the final piece of the decryption key for the entire city's infrastructure." He turned around then, and I saw his face. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a random operative. It was the man Sterling had been reporting to for years. The man who had been the architect of the very organization Sterling was allegedly breaking the law to serve. "Welcome home, Elena," he said, staring directly at the vent where I was hiding. "You aren't the consultant anymore. You're the hostage, and you've just helped me lock the doors to this city from the inside out." He tapped a key on his console, and the floor of the ventilation duct beneath me gave a sharp, mechanical click. Before I could scramble back, the section of the floor retracted, and I plummeted into the darkness of the room below. I hit the cold, polished floor with a sickening thud. The wind knocked out of me. Before I could even roll over, two figures in matte gray uniforms were at my side, pinning my arms with terrifying clinical precision. The man at the console didn't even look back at me. He just continued typing, the rhythmic clatter of the holographic keys sounding like the final nails in a coffin. "The override code is active," he murmured, his voice smooth and devoid of any human warmth. "The grid is officially under new management." Sterling was a useful relic, but he was always too sentimental to finish the work. I gasped for air, struggling against the iron grip of the guards. "Sterling, where is he? What did you do to him?" The man turned around, finally. He was younger than I expected, with eyes that looked like shattered glass. He walked toward me, his boots clicking against the pristine floor. "Sterling is currently being processed by the same agency you were running from. He sacrificed his clearance to get you here, Elena. He truly believed you were the one person who could dismantle this system. What he didn't realize is that you were never the player. You were the key." He reached out and snatched the glowing metallic coin from my limp hand. It pulsed with a brilliant, frantic blue light, a heartbeat of data that had cost me everything. He slotted it into a port on the side of his console. The room groaned, a deep, subsonic tremor that vibrated through the floorboards as the city's entire security infrastructure shifted. Every camera, every motion sensor, every automated barricade in the metropolis was now feeding directly into this room. "You think you've won?" I spat, my voice regaining its edge. "But Sterling wasn't as sentimental as you think. He didn't give me that coin to help you decrypt the city. He gave it to me because he knew you'd take it." The man paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "Don't be dramatic, consultant. You're in a containment chamber. You have no resources, no comms, no leverage." "I don't need leverage," I whispered, a small, weary smile playing on my lips. "I just needed you to plug that coin into your master node." The coin in the console suddenly turned a jagged, violent crimson. A shrill digital scream pierced the room, causing the guards to recoil and cover their ears. The holographic displays began to flicker and glitch, showing lines of cascading, corrupted code. "What did you do?" the man hissed, lunging for the console. "What did you do?" "It wasn't a decryption key," I said, my voice steady. "It was a logic bomb. Sterling programmed it to trigger the moment it detected a high-level administrative bypass. The exact kind of bypass you've been using to manipulate the city's security. You didn't just lock the doors, you just gave the entire system a self-destruct command." The room began to shake violently. Sirens wailed, not the police or the agents, but the emergency shutdown protocols of the facility itself. The containment chamber's reinforced glass began to spiderweb with cracks. The man stood paralyzed as the monitors behind him exploded in a shower of sparks and black smoke. "You've killed us all," he shrieked, scrambling for the exit, but the doors had already slammed shut and magnetically sealed. "No," I said, pulling myself to my feet as the guards, confused and panicked, loosened their grip. "I've just deleted your influence." The floor beneath us gave a final, shuddering jolt, and the facility's main generator, the heart of their organized scheme, went dark. Total silence descended. No hum of electricity, no glowing monitors, no whirring of servos. Just the sound of the city breathing outside, finally free of the digital leash they'd held over it for years. I kicked open the weakened containment door, which had unlocked when the power failed. I didn't look back at the architect of my misery, who was now frantically clawing at a dead console. I walked through the dark corridors of the facility, following the emergency egress signs that were now illuminated by flickering, dying battery lights. When I burst out of the heavy iron fire exit, I found myself in a narrow alley behind the city's central plaza. The night air was cool, and for the first time in my life, the city felt quiet. No sirens, no patrol cruisers prowling for prey, no tactical units waiting in the shadows. A black sedan was waiting at the end of the alley, its engine idling. The door opened, and Sterling stepped out. He looked haggard, his suit torn and covered in dust, but he was alive. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face, and he exhaled a long, shaky breath. "It's done?" he asked, his voice rough. "It's done," I replied, walking toward him. "The override is wiped. The system is back to factory settings. Everything they built is gone." He nodded, a look of profound relief washing over his features. "They're going to be hunting for the ghost who broke the grid for the rest of our lives, Elena. Are you ready for that?" I looked up at the stars, now visible above the city skyline for the first time in years, unmarred by the glare of security floodlights. I thought about the patrol officers who had tried to break me, the agents who had hunted me, and the man who had tried to own the city. They were all scrambling in the dark now, stripped of their power, exposed by the very chaos they had created. "Let them hunt," I said, climbing into the passenger seat of the sedan. "I'm tired of being the prey. I think it's time we see what the world looks like without a handler." Sterling got behind the wheel, put the car in gear, and we drove away from the center of the city. We didn't head for the airport or a safe house. We drove toward the edge of the grid, toward the open road where no cameras existed and no protocols governed the silence. The arrest that was meant to be the end of my life had turned out to be the beginning of my freedom. And as we disappeared into the dawn, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just a consultant anymore. I was the person who had pulled the plug on an empire, and I wasn't planning on ever plugging it back in.